Well, good afternoon, National Museum of American History and Smithsonian colleagues, and welcome to another presentation of the Smithsonian Staff Learning Series, where we explore the trends, topics, and research relating to the public so that we may better understand our current and future audiences. My name is Adam Rozan. I'm the Director of Programs and Audience Development at the National Museum of American History and your host and moderator for the series. For today's talk, we'll be exploring Generation Z, those born between 1997 and 2012, and who today are between the ages of 10 and 26, a generation representing 68.6 million Americans, or approximately 21% of the population. Our speaker today is Andrew Roth, the founder and CEO of dcdx, a Gen Z research and strategy firm that provides a Gen Z approach to its work. Our speaker graduated in 2021 from Vanderbilt University with a BS in Human and Organizational Development. And since graduating, has been growing dcdx, his company, while traveling around the world. Aside from his various entrepreneurial and change-driven journeys, Andrew is just another Gen Zer who loves sports, painting, reading, and mindlessly scrolling on TikTok. Please note that this discussion is being recorded with closed captioning, and I'll be helping our speaker by moderating the chat, so please add your questions there. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Adam, for the introduction, and really appreciate the time that we took to set this up, and appreciate the time that all of you took today to come here and chat. I think one thing that I always say is just I really appreciate the people willing to listen to the young voices that are shaping the future, and I think even just the intentionality behind this is fantastic. So really appreciate that, and want to make this as helpful and useful as possible for all of you. So I know we're going to have a Q&A towards the end and open up a discussion, but as Adam mentioned, if there's any questions there in the meantime, feel free to shoot them in the chat. We can pause to address during or after, I mean, however you see fit. So that's the goal, and I can pull up some slides that we can get started. Does that sound good to you, Adam?
Yep, perfect.
Beautiful. All righty. Can we see all right?
Yep.
Excellent. All righty. Well, once again, thanks for joining. I'm here to discuss a couple different things with you today. One of them being app usage, and the other being the Gen Z score, which we'll certainly talk more about. But first, probably wondering why there's a 24-year-old talking up here at a bunch of professionals in the working world. And so I want to give a quick bit of context to who I am and kind of what I'm doing here. And Adam mentioned that graduated 2 years ago from Vanderbilt, and really at the time I was actually studying abroad in London when COVID happened and got sent home from the pandemic, and it was very obvious at that time that young voices were asking for things and they weren't being listened to. And that was only exacerbated by the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so to me, it became very clear, there was a problem, right? How do we connect the voices of young people to the organizations that are shaping our future? As a Gen Zer myself, as someone who had sat through classes in college, who had been, who's grown up in the same world that all of my peers have grown up, I think the one challenge in my mind was the methods in which that was being done were not resonating with myself. They were not resonating with an authentic way that my generation was communicating and behaving. And so what I set out to do at that point was to say, hey, how can we change that, right? How can we take a Gen Z approach to research and really transform the way this is done? So dcdx is a Gen Z founded and Gen Z focused strategy and advisory firm. Our approach to research is a Gen Z approach. We work across a variety of verticals and industries, working with brands like Chipotle, Hinge, YouTube, and Google, also a lot of agencies and nonprofits as well. And so the entire company, the entire approach is actually kind of based and rooted in this name, dcdx. And you're probably wondering what that means. Well, if you remember your physics or math classes back from high school and college, it's actually a reference to the derivative. Dy dx means the rate of change of y over time. And so we've replaced y with c, and c stands for culture. And so all that to say, our entire focus is about how do we understand how culture is changing, how that's changing the way we understand the consumers that are around us. And that's the lens we use to view this generation. It's the lens we use to understand culture. And that's as you'll see, and as we get into our methodologies and our research, that's really kind of how we approach all of this. As I mentioned, Gen Z founded and Gen Z run. We're right now a Gen Z team of 6 scattered all across the world. I actually just got back I was living in Portugal for a couple months and just got back now. I'm in Austin, Texas. We got some folks in Barcelona, Chicago, DC, I don't know, people change all the time, but that's the Gen Z side. We also work with a board of advisors that are really helping to shape the direction and some of the higher level thinking that's going on. It's not just a bunch of kids running around and doing crazy stuff. That's that. But as I mentioned, everything we do has a different focus and a different approach to it. We call this human-centered research for Gen Z. One of those methods is we have a network on Instagram of about 100,000 Gen Zers, and we use that as a way to just really get a pulse into Gen Z. Open-ended questions, poll questions, interviews, focus groups, we host it all on Instagram, and what this gives us is a really raw and unfiltered look into the heart of this generation. And I mention this now because I think it helps to understand the research we do, which I'll introduce in a second here. But it's just this different way, rather than the traditional 60 question survey that gets sent to a 16-year-old, via email. It's an Instagram poll question they're answering from a friend's Instagram story, and so it gives us a much more raw and authentic insight into the way this generation behaves. The second part of our methodology that I think is really interesting here is what we call brand magnetism. It's this idea of measuring the ways in which brands today are resonating with consumers. The methods of the past would send a 60 question survey out to people asking, hey, what brand comes to mind when you think of snacking? And you have to list snacking and then a snacking brand, and then you rank those. And so the idea today is that that's not the most effective way to understand the brands that are resonating with today's consumers. And so our approach is to say, brand magnetism is about the popularity and consistency at which people are talking about your brand online. Young people are talking about your brand. So if young people are using their own platforms to share their voices and talk about your brand, that's meaningful. And if we can quantify that and measure that, we call that brand magnetism, and we quantify that, and we rank that on a scale. And so again, introducing these things to be able to introduce the research to you shortly here, but I think they're important ways that showcase not only that our methods of research, but that to understand this generation, you just have to look in a different way itself. And that's what's really important about this. So the first study research I wanted to introduce to you was around app usage. So with that network of Gen Zers we have on Instagram, we asked them to send us a recording of their screen time. So, the comparison would be to send a survey question to say, hey, how much time do you spend on TikTok? But no, this time they're pulling up their iPhones, they're going into settings, they're going to screen time, and they're literally sending a recording to us of all of the time they're spending on all of the apps they're spending it on. And so what we get from this is a really unique look at the ways in which Gen Zers are spending their time on their devices. This past year, so this was for 2022, the average daily screen time of a Gen Zer was 6 hours and 41 minutes. That's up, but it's basically about the same as last year. The median increased about 6% year over year. And what's really interesting about this is just that's a lot of time. I mean, almost 7 hours a day on their phones alone. That's not inclusive of computers or other devices. That is just their iPhones. And that's fascinating. And what's even more fascinating is when we start to break this down into where that's being spent. The full report has all this broken down in detail, but wanted to highlight the top 10 apps here. So we rank these apps by the weekly average screen time, and that's the WAST number on the left side there. But that means the average screen time they're spending per week on this app, and it's inclusive of the percent of people who spend time on that app. So as you'll see on the left side, Instagram is number one because the most amount of people are spending the most amount of time on the app. So rankings are Instagram, TikTok, iMessage, YouTube, and Snapchat in the top 5. Now, we've also been doing this year over year, and so we can start to see some changes in behavior and usage. And one thing we point out this year is that Snapchat is falling a little bit out of use with this audience, and I think there's a lot of reasons we can dive into later on why that is. But again, overall, just a really interesting lens into the ways in which young people are spending time, where they're spending that time. And how much time that is. And I think as we look at the difference between like an Instagram and a TikTok, obviously, TikTok is always mentioned as like the app that so many people are spending time on. Well, even though if the percent of people who have Instagram in their top 10, most people are using Instagram, 94%, and only 55% are using TikTok. But of that 55%, they're spending an incredible amount of time on the platform, right? Those who had it in their top 3 apps are spending nearly 14 hours per week on the app. And we actually break this down a little bit further. Let me come back. I'll come back to that Instagram slide. When we break this down a little bit further, I'll come back through this, but of the active TikTok users that we're looking at, 3 out of 4 are using TikTok for 1 month per year, which is an absurd number. So the 55% that are using TikTok in our report, 75% of that 55% are using TikTok for 1 month out of a year, 30.4 days per year, which is just an absurd amount of time to think about. Because if you could have 1 month of your life back every year, like what would you do with that? And so I think I will get into a conversation in a bit of like what that means, but I just want to put that into perspective on just how much time on a singular platform that's taking up in the lives of young people. There's also a question of like, what is that replacing? And is that healthy? Was it unhealthy? There's pretty obvious answers to those questions, but it's just to understand how much time purely this is taking out of our day-to-day lives, I think is a really meaningful and important thing, a stat to understand. I mentioned I'd come back through this, but just a quick look at Instagram and Snapchat. Again, Instagram just, I think, tends to get overlooked because it's just been around for so long, but it's still one of the most dominant platforms for young people, just purely based on the number of people spending time on it and the amount of time they're spending. It's an everyday part of our lives. And I think both from a communication perspective, people are sending a lot of messages on the platform. Today it's less about posts on Instagram as it is about stories, as it is about reels, and as it is about communication in direct messages. Snapchat is an app that's always been popular with young people, and I think we're starting to see that as social platforms are evolving, the role of Snapchat is changing, and it's less about the screen time being spent on it and more about the communication methods and kind of the more direct one-to-one communication on the platform. So, they prioritized their Spotlight, which was basically a TikTok competitor in a sense, and that kind of fell out of favor with a lot of young people. And so they're starting to see some of the decline in screen time, which may or may not be a sign for the platform's longevity, but also might be more just a sign of the changing ways in which young people are using the platform. They're focused a lot more on their camera usage, their augmented reality. And I think especially in the educational museum related space, AR is a huge, hugely important technology to understand the way young people are interacting with it. I think Snapchat's one of those platforms that's doing that really well. But yes, to come back to some of the TikTok conversation, we break this down by year and by gender and by age as well. So young people are spending more time on the platform, and this year time has gone up significantly compared to last. Also interesting to note the average weekly pickups is basically how many times people are picking up the app per day or per week in this case, and that's up 140% year over year. And so people are picking up TikTok itself more this year and spending more time on it compared to last year, where it might have been 1 pickup and 2 hours, but this year might be 4 pickups and 3 hours. And so the app, kind of a signal that the app is becoming a little bit more ingrained into the day-to-day of our lives. All right. And then, obviously coming back to the idea that it's a lot of time being spent on that platform. So that's the first part of the research. I know we're going quick through this, but happy to address comments that come in, and also in the Q&A we can talk back through some of the stats on that stuff. Adam, did you want to pause for I don't know if there's any chats coming through that are
just a shout out from
Sure.
the Us team that they are huge fans of DCDX. No, I think
Awesome.
It's great. This is wonderful, and unfortunately very startling to find out that people are losing a month of their lives.
Yeah. Not a healthy number, but so as I mentioned, we also have this approach where we look at brand magnetism, and as I mentioned, we define this as a brand's ability to attract popular and consistent user-generated content, right? UGC, we call it, is today's currency for modern brands. It's the way in which young people are expressing their opinions online, organically, non-incentivized about a brand or a platform. And when we're measuring this, we look at these two things: the popularity of that content and the consistency of that content. So the more popular content is, and the more consistent that popularity is, the more, in theory, that brand is attracting that conversation in. And so every year we publish a study on the top 25, quote unquote, most magnetic brands. And this year, this is our rankings. And so I'll leave this here just as a backdrop, and it can have some interesting dialogue around this, but I think there's some really meaningful takeaways from this just overview as a highlight. Number one, I think a lot of times in the conversations around Gen Z, it tends to focus on all the more newsworthy and sexy conversations on, hey, here's the hottest brand and here's all this stuff. But at the same time, a lot of these brands are brands that have been around for a long time, brands that millennials loved growing up, brands that even older generations have loved. And so I think what our methodology shows us is that it's easier to stay where you are than it is it's easier to stay where you are than it is to climb up the ladder, right? Like these brands have been around for so long, and obviously it's possible to fall out of favor with the generation, but it's also, I think we tend to forget that these are brands that have built such a presence in our lives that they're still present. And I think the ones that succeeds really well in this are the ones that can also segment their marketing and their approach towards the young audiences. A couple notable differences, though, that do exist with this is, number one, a focus on gaming. So if you look at the top 5, Twitch and Roblox are up there in the top 5. Those are 2 platforms that young people are spending a lot of time on. There was just a Roblox study published. I can't remember exactly what it was, but this is a gaming platform which young people are spending so much time. They're talking with their friends. This is like the replacement for literally like going out to a park with your friends. You're going into Roblox and playing a game with them. And Twitch as well is where they're watching that happen, right? Twitch is a live streaming platform where people are watching gaming happen. So it's just an interesting way to engage with the gaming audience, but it also I think it showcases just how prevalent this force is in the lives of young people. You also look at Xbox and PlayStation as and Nintendo as well as gaming brands that are on this list. A couple other noticeable call outs. I think the one thing that always gets people's attention is Crocs. People are like, Crocs are the ugliest shoe known to man. Why would they be on Gen Z's list of top brands? Well, Crocs has done 2 things really well. One, they've played, I think the timing of COVID was favorable for them. After COVID, I think young people and many people in general started to adopt more of a comfort first mentality. Obviously, Crocs is well positioned for that, but at the same time, I think the brand itself has done really well to not only embrace that, but combine that with kind of a youth focused approach, right? They do a lot of influencer marketing work. They've collaborated with some of Gen Z's top artists and top icons to create these custom shoes that sell out pretty much instantly. And so I think they just published that their earnings year over year, which have blown past some of their previous records. And so they are continue to innovate at a really high level, and I think resonate really well with what young people are looking for from the brands that they work with. I actually went into a Chipotle the other day, and I looked behind the counter and every single employee was wearing Crocs. I was like, what is happening? I don't understand, but everyone was just wearing Crocs as they're, making the burritos and chefing up in the back. It was pretty crazy to see, but it also is so telling of the way in which this brand has expanded into the lives of everyone, because it's just comfort first. And I think the ugly, there's an ugly aesthetic to them, in which case people are actually embracing that as a sense of style. But yes, that's kind of a quick overview on some of those. And again, this is all public. In this report, we break down each of these brands individually and kind of go through a case by case analysis of what really caused the conversation for these brands. Actually, there's one more call out I think is relevant here. Shein, number 20, is one of the fashion brands that Gen Zers love. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a fast fashion brand. And so I think what we get challenged and questioned on a lot regarding this is this generation claims to be the most sustainable, focused and environmentally friendly generation, calling for help on the climate. But at the same time, they're going and buying at a massive scale. They're going to buy from Shein, right? This brand that is contributing pretty harmfully to the environment. And so that single kind of paradox is something we see a lot in youth culture. And it's something I think with this generation is something we are, that manifests itself a lot. And there was some interesting research that came out from YPulse, which is another Gen Z focused research firm, but most Gen Zers viewed Shein as a criminal organization for contributing to the environment in such a way, but at the same time, they viewed their actions, their individual actions buying Shein, not as criminal. They viewed those as fair and equitable. And so I think this dynamic of, how can we be held responsible individually when these organizations are contributing to this, to this crisis, it creates this paradox, because clearly you're the reason they're able to sell. And so there's a lot of factors that play into why that paradox exists and why that contradiction exists. But I think at the end of the day, to understand, number one, this generation is still developing their own sense of identity. So some of those questions they don't have answers to, but at the same time, they're kind of forced to have an answer, right? When you're 17 years old and you really care about the environment, but you also want to fit in at school, and you want to make sure that you're fashionable and you're showing up, in the way you want to show up, and you don't have money to spend on an H&M, or probably H&M is not a good example, but on a more expensive brand, you can get in 2 days, you can get a really cheap dress that's on trend and on style delivered to you, quickly. And so I think that it's challenging your sense of identity, but at the same time, giving you an option to a convenient and affordable option to just get what you need, and then confront that moral contradiction later on when you need to face that. And so again, these examples exist in many different areas of culture, but I think it's a really fascinating look into just into the mindset of how young people are behaving. And so I was talking with Adam, and we wanted to make sure we left with some kind of really tangible insights here, and so have three I guess supposed truths or things that are said a lot about Gen Zers, and then three things that they really mean or that they're really trying to say. One thing we talk a lot about is that this world of Gen Z news is very noisy. There tends to be a lot of information, and a lot of that information tends to not be very meaningful. It's very press worthy, but it might not be very helpful. And so our goal is to really kind of dispel some of those myths and to help you understand what they're really saying about people. So what people say about Gen Z and what it really means. Number one, if you've heard this before, the idea of a digital native gets thrown around a lot about this generation. In theory, this means that this is a generation that has been brought up digitally, right? They grew up with the iPhone, they grew up with the internet, they grew up with all these things at their fingertips. What tends to get overlooked and kind of misunderstood when talking about this is not just what it is, but what it caused, right? What it has led to, and how that has shaped this generation. And what we like to say is that the idea of being brought up as a digital native has turned into this behavioral mindset of convenience as a necessity. And I talked about the Shein example because I think it's relevant to this as well. Convenience is something that is not just like a want to have or a fun to have, it's a need to have, right? The things need to be convenient, not because we want it, because we've grown up in a way that everything we've had in our lives has been there instantly, right? We've never had a second to doubt what's 10,004 squared divided by 12. You can do that, but at the same time, you can also figure out who the president of Dubai is, and then who it was at the first. I mean, there's these things that have been ingrained in our behavioral mindset as we've grown up. And so the idea of a digital native is not to say that, yeah, they've grew up with the iPhone, so it means they're needy. It's like everything we do has this expectation that it's going to be convenient. Now, one thing we're seeing is that this is not necessary. There's some ways in which this is good, but this is also leading to some really harmful behaviors. And we work a lot in the dating space with Hinge, and one thing we're seeing is that the convenience of dating is actually destroying dating itself, right? Like the idea that you can have access to unlimited potential partners instantly from anywhere in the world you want is causing us to actually rewire our mindset as we're going about the dating approach, and it's harming our that approach in itself. And so again, can get into more of that later, but I think the idea of convenience is like, there are so many positives that can come from it. Yeah, I just moved into a new city and I ordered a desk and it got here overnight, and now I have a desk, and so that's great. But at the same time, like, what is that doing? Is that mindset helpful? Is that a helpful behavior to have? Because what are you passing? What are you foregoing as you're moving towards convenience, right? What are you giving up? You're giving up a lot of the journey that you take to get there, right? In the dating, again, coming back to the dating example, it's you can find any partner you want, but you're also going to avoid then that hard conversation you need to have with a potential partner that's going to force you to grow and force you to learn from that. And so what do you forego with convenience? Well, you forego a lot of the growth that happens with that. And so I think one challenge we pose to a lot of the organizations we work with is how can we actually make things inconveniently helpful for people? How can we play into convenience's strength where we need to, and then how can we force people to confront some of the situations that they may not have confronted because it's going to actually help them in the long run. All right, number 2. I think this is the most buzzwordy of the buzzwords: authenticity. If you look up any Gen Z article, you will see and hear something about what it means to be authentic. And I would ask anyone who wrote those, like, what it actually means. To be honest with you, I think there's so many definitions that no one has a real definition of what it means. But when we think about authenticity, we think about this mental model that Gen Z has for information overload, right? This generation, to come back to the digital native point, has grown up not only with access to these things, but so much information comes to us on a day-to-day basis. You just saw, we talked about a month per year on TikTok. The amount of information that's passing through your mind when you're spending a month per year on TikTok is incredible, right? It's insane. And so what that causes, and what we've developed as a result, is we've grown up with this mental model for sorting through information at a fast and like immediate rate, right? We need to be able to differentiate in our minds what's helpful content and what's salesy, or what's just trying to get our money. And so the idea of authenticity is actually to say what young people are really looking for is just a brand who can get out of that cycle of like repetitive information overload, that actually speaks to who they're looking for, people that are being genuine, right? Authenticity is about being genuine and showing up for who you are. And that's because of this model that young people have of needing to sort through all this information. Because when we're seeing all of it all the time, the things that stand out are the things that actually feel genuine, that feel like they're not just trying to get our money. They actually feel like, Gen Zers feel like they're trying to help the world. They feel like they're actually speaking to the values that they hold. And that's what we're looking for when we talk about authenticity. That's what young people want to see from brands and organizations. They want to see them standing for the things they actually care about in a genuine way. And the last kind of buzzwordy topic that I think is misunderstood a lot is this idea of community. This is more of a recent one, so it's not quite as buzzwordy as the rest of them, but there's a lot of now articles talking about the importance of community for Gen Z and what it means to have a community first strategy. How do you develop a community with young people? And it's important. I think it's an important strategy to go for, but again, it's like this really gray term because it doesn't really truly mean anything. And so when we think about what it means to develop a community and why it's important for Gen Z, it's because this generation, along with many generations, have this deep fundamental longing for human connection and belonging. Obviously, that's a universal human need. And I'm not going to sit up here and pretend I know what it's like to be 60 and have that need as well. But what I do know is that this generation lost a lot of this in some of the most fundamental years of their life, right? The last 3 years, 2021, 2022, as young people were in high school or in college, the connections that they were supposedly making and shaping at that time, with friends and in school, were lost. And when you add that to that number, to come back to that TikTok number, when you add that to the 1 month per year that's being taken out of so many people's lives, that question I posed earlier of what is that replacing, right? What is that 1 month per year replacing? And there's a study that shows that's replacing time spent in real life with friends. And I think the reason I hesitate to call it a community-centric thing is because typically this is meaning digital first community strategy, right? How can we create community on Discord or on Reddit or on Instagram? But what we're really looking for as young people from a community strategy is for us to be able to get together and to actually develop those connections. because that's what we've been missing, not only from COVID. It was emphasized by COVID, but social media is taking these meaningful connections and they're just removing them. And so as we talk about like our mission and our goal as a company, and just, as a Gen Zer myself, like we talk about making the future human, what it means to really make the future a better place. And I think this is really at the core of it is how can we use all these things we know about this generation to shape this need for connection and belonging for a generation that really needs it, right? I mean, the other stats that come along with that 1 month per year on TikTok is also a significant rise in anxiety, a significant rise in depression, a significant rise in suicide and attempted suicide, all these really, really harmful and negative things that are happening. And so they're clearly aligned with the time spent online. And so when we think about, community first and all this and all of the things we've talked about today, I think the big question is how can we change the direction in which this is all heading for young people, and how can we help to facilitate some of the connections that we really need to be making in real life and find that sense of belonging. And so yeah, I mean that's all I got, and I know I went through a lot of that pretty quickly, but wanted to get through the content and leave some time for discussion. So thanks for listening.
Fantastic, and thank you so much again for walking us through that information and for sharing all those different pieces. I wonder if you can, we have several questions that have come in. There's going to be a bunch about TikTok because of the policies in the federal government and Smithsonian usage, but I wonder if you could just talk for a second about your recommendations that you make and that dcdx make towards those brands that you work with, but how they can help with Gen Z's belonging, to create belonging, and do so. Can you maybe respond? What role could museums and specifically the Smithsonian play and to create a sense of belonging for Gen Z? And then we'll dive into TikTok and some of the other topics, I promise. So please keep the questions coming, and thank you for them, and thank you for the comments.
Yeah, and I'll hop out of that screen share here. When we work with organizations to help to create that sense of belonging, a lot of it is about, what we can't do is ignore digital. Obviously it's such a presence that it's not, the answer is not to ignore it and to focus on something else. It's to say, how can we actually use digital to find a way to connect people in real life? How can we use that as a way to bring people together? And so, even in I think when you talk about the Smithsonian and the museum space, these are physical. I think what a museum has as an advantage over so many other brands and organizations is that it has a physical location, right? It has a physical experience that is associated with being present. And so how can we use technology to actually bring people into those spaces to help them find those connections in real life? And that's what we challenge a lot of the brands we work with to do. Again, to come back to that Hinge example, we're not working with them to say, how can we get better matches on Hinge? No, it's how can we actually help young people create healthier relationships by having those harder conversations, by pushing them to do that. And so I think the idea of belonging, there's no replacement for in-person connection, but the replacement, the way in which you get there has changed. So how can we use technology to facilitate that?
That's great. And Andrew, the Smithsonian is not allowed to create their own TikTok accounts, or as are many of the other federal agencies are not allowed to. So what advice and guidance do you have for agencies like the Smithsonian, and what strategies have you seen that have worked? And then there's another comment there, even about the difference between working with influencers, and the difference without having that. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, good question. So the approach I outlined earlier about brand magnetism is solely based on user-generated content. We're not looking at content that brands are creating. Nothing comes from an influencer. Nothing comes from a brand. It's all organically from young people. And what's important about that is the way in which young people are being influenced today to make decisions and to talk about things. And so I guess I would say that you don't necessarily need a TikTok platform to be viral on TikTok. What you need is a strategy for an understanding of, if we can get young people to have conversations online about the Smithsonian, about their experience, is there a way they can be documenting their experience at the Smithsonian so that they can go and share that with friends? that's what's going to be, most influential. Like they're not going to probably even listen to, and I'm sure there's, you could have an effective strategy that's on TikTok, but what's most impactful is the billions and billions of views that these brands are getting from people just talking about their experience there. And so I think what we work on a lot is what kind of products and experiences can we help to create in a physical setting that enable people and encourage people to create that content, to have those conversations, to be sharing, like what's that shareable and viral worthy experience that's going to get people to talk.
That's great. We have a hand raised, Caroline Klebanoff. What's your question for our guest?
Yes. So thank you, Andrew. This is super helpful. I mean, the urgency is so clear to me and probably many others on this call of what institutions like ours need to do to serve this generation better and meet them where they are. So my question for you is, like, museums like ours have some lagging indicators because we don't sell tickets necessarily, to everything. And we're philanthropically supported. So unlike a brand, you don't have the quick feedback loops where you see like, okay, we don't have these consumers, they're not buying our products, or they were, but they're dropping off. So we sometimes don't know how bad it is, I think. So my question for you is like, what advice do you give some of the more resistant brands or brands that are maybe slower to change to really get that this is so important and so urgent to have your ear to the ground on what young people are actually doing and saying in their real lives?
Yeah, it's a great question. Appreciate you asking that. I think there's you can talk to as many consultants and get as many perspectives as you need on this, but what I've found to be most effective is talking to young people and listening. Like there is nothing more powerful than hearing the story of a young person to help to understand and change your perspective on a matter, right? Like again, we can show whatever data. I mean, we had an interesting project with the university recently where, there's so much data that exists out there on the problems that they're having, all this stuff. But at the end of the day, like what they needed to hear was the voices of their students. And that's what's going to help to facilitate this change. And that's what's going to help to get people in the mindset that this is a really different generation, right? The emotions and the feelings and the experiences that these young people have lived, that's what's really going to help to create some of that change. And so I guess I would say, like, do as much as possible to put the resisting voices, or at least put the voices that may not be as open to these changes, in front of young people and just have them listen. And if at that point they're not willing to adjust or adapt their mindset, then I think, I mean, that's a personal issue at that point, but like that's where we see the most effective solutions happening. And that's why I think and that's why our purpose is to bring young voices to the table, because that's what really shapes the narrative here.
That's great. Thank you. In December, in the New York Times, they profiled a series of Luddite clubs across the country that originated out of New York. These are groups that are deliberately not participating in social media, that don't have smartphones, right? They have flip phones and whatnot, but to meet in real time. Can you talk a little bit about that? And are you seeing a backlash to that time commitment, and maybe in response to the fact that the pandemic took so much away from this group? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I love that. The Luddite articles, and there's been a lot of those different types of clubs and organizations that have started to form. Actually, we recently wrote a piece on this, that we're starting to see these signals. The Luddite Club was one of these signals, but we're starting to see these signals of kind of this resistance to the digital focused world we're living in start to emerge in youth culture. There was recently a big trend on TikTok called core. It was hashtag core. I don't know how else to describe it, but it was essentially the idea of a core on TikTok. There's cottage core, there's all these different cores, is like this specific type of content that you kind of get funneled into with the algorithm. But core was supposedly was this idea of actually a trend about the way in which trends and digital culture has accelerated so fast to the point that we feel we've lost control. And so in theory, core is this movement to say, let's take a step back, let's take the headphones off and experience the world around us. The irony of it was that it's a TikTok trend about the the use of TikTok trends to accelerate culture. So there has some pros and cons to it, but we're starting to see these signals emerge more and more. And I think that's what actually has given me a lot of hope and optimism for the direction in which culture is going, is that I think young people are gravitating more towards these experiences, not necessarily because they want to, but because they need to, right? Because they're realizing that their mental health is most important. They have to stop. They have to stop what they're doing. They have to change something, or else these trends are only going to continue to get worse. And so the Luddite Club is just one really good example that got highlighted, but I think we see these signals emerging in different kind of small pockets of culture that are all pointing to the same direction.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew. And Kelly, they met each other and word of mouth spread the club. We have Lexi has her hand up. Lexi, what question do you have?
Hi, thank you. This is fascinating, and thanks for sharing all of your research with us. So I work in exhibition interpretation, and so being visitor-centered across demographics is something that's at the core of what we do. And I was wondering what advice you would give, because the goal and the methods with this generation feel a little paradoxical, where you mentioned that this user-generated content is kind of what drives them and how to engage them best. But at the same time, it's almost at the root of what the problem is, of what they're seeking is community. So like you mentioned, we're a very physical space because we're a museum. And so what would you recommend in terms of creating tools and opportunities within the galleries that are not digital, that are meant to help you facilitate social learning and discussion, but then by default, you don't have that opportunity to develop that content because then you would be having that experience through the lens of a digital aid. What would your advice be for kind of like finding a common ground between those two?
Thanks, Lexi.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, and this is where we talk about like while a lot of the negatives that come from digital, it's still really important to understand how to use that to facilitate some of the the in-person connection, right? Like what I'm not saying is to get rid of the digital side of things at all. A lot of there's a term that gets thrown around a lot, like the phygital spaces, physical and digital combination. I think the goal is to figure out how can we use those technologies to bring people together, to help to facilitate those connections. And I talked about augmented reality. I think is one of those really unique solutions where you can point a camera at a wall, but you can feel and live in this experience around you, and there's ways you can make that a social experience as well, and people can record and share that. And so I think I know I know you're looking for some very tangible steps, and I think we can have some of those conversations later on too, but I think like at the core of it is this is finding that balance, and is finding the middle ground between their need. You're not going to be able to connect with this generation unless there is a digital component, but what we need to do is be able to figure out how to apply that to the physical surroundings.
That's great. Thank you very much. I want to go back to Caroline's question for a second. I was sharing with you earlier in the New York Times today, it was reported that Gen Z is drinking less milk. And so big milk, if that's such a thing, is concerned. And so I'm not going to equate the Smithsonian to milk, but I wonder if milk called you up, or big milk called you up and said, help us think about changing the perception of milk consumption, and how do you start that conversation? And so can you answer that, Andrew, from what are some of the things that you might encourage them to think about, but also what does it look like within the organization, within Big Milk, that allows them to kind of think and work differently to engage this generation?
That is a question I don't think I've ever gotten before.
The Big Milk side, or the
Big Milk side. The Big Milk side. That's interesting.
Have to read that article.
Yeah. I think at the core of it, it starts with the same answer I've given a couple of times, which is bring young people in to listen to what they're saying. I think the influences on what to drink are now coming from so many different sources. There is now a variety of different sources of information to trust and to question on, like, what is a healthy drink, what actually helps you develop, and what's good for you, what's bad for you, and that's now coming from a widely decentralized collection of sources. And so I think the first step is to understand, to really discover and listen to your audience, to say, number one, what do you believe about milk to be true? Where have you learned that, and how is that being influenced, and how is that being shaped? And then working with them. I think we talk a lot about like co-creation and collaboration, but how can we bring people into that experience to help to shape that change together? And that's where we see a lot of effective results, is not just making decisions for Gen Z about milk, not saying, hey, okay, we heard that the Got Milk campaign from years back is actually was canceled. Like, it's not just that, it's how can we actually work with you to create the next campaign? We're not just going to create it because you told us that. We're going to work with you to shape that together.
And do you find the successful companies and brands are the ones that staff these areas of their organizations differently, that have more folks dedicated to not just the kind of social media production and content, but also the audience piece of it?
Yeah. I mean, I think when we look at the brands that top that list of the top 25, they're very, very intentional about how, not only like what their perception is in culture and how they shift and kind of evolve with that. And that's both from a social media side, but also at a higher level, like the insights and research side. I think it's never been more important in today's world to have that ear on the ground of like understanding how that's changing, because there's so much data out there, and almost at a point where there's too much that you can't sift through what's really important for you. And so being able to again, not only bring in those voices to talk to them, but to say, to actually integrate that into your organization is what helps them move at the speed of culture itself.
That's great. Daria, you have your hand up. What question do you have for our guest?
Thanks for taking my question. My name is Daria Wingreen, and I work in the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. And I think I have a few questions. I'm totally the proud parent of two Gen Zers at different ends of the Gen Z spectrum. They're 10 years apart, and they have conflict with each other around how to use social media, and which I find really interesting. So my question for you is, a person who is actually brought up in the Gen Z and are now like a professional working in there, a knowledgeable person, and you're talking to a bunch of museum people, how do you engage, knowing what you know, with all the knowledge that you have and all of the biases that you have as a person who's been a digital native, or whatever we want to call it? How do you engage at museums, or do you even go to museums at this point? And I keep hearing the name brand come up. I know the Smithsonian is a brand. It's a big, huge brand, and it's certainly not on your list, right? So I guess, we're not a video game. We're not a clothing shop. We're not. So I'm just curious, how would you engage in a museum as you as a person, not like what you've read about?
Great question. Thanks for the question.
I really like that question. To me, I think the first thing that goes through my mind, again, as a Gen Zer, is like, what do I get from a museum? Is it education? Because I can get education now from so many different places. Like, YouTube, we didn't talk about YouTube at all in this conversation, but as an education platform, YouTube is more helpful than school. I mean, I'll just, like, for the most part, most young people would say YouTube is more educational than their high school, or in some cases their college, right? And so I think what I would question to myself, and I think even putting on that more of a research hat, like, what role does a museum play in the lives of young people in today's world? I think is a really, really meaningful question to start with. Because if it's an educational question, then I would ask you back, like, why can't I learn that on YouTube, or even on TikTok, or anywhere else? Why can't I learn that there? And I think if we can figure out the answer to that question, there is a meaningful role that the museum plays. And a lot of that will likely come back to that physical experience that we talked about earlier of there's some connection to the presence and experience of being there that like that is the differentiator between a YouTube and a Smithsonian. I know that's a crazy comparison to make, but like I think that is a real competition in a sense of like that's where young people are getting their education from. And so how, if we can figure out the answer to that, how does the physical experience help to change what that role actually means for a museum in the life of a young person? Because I personally, to your point, like I would go to an art museum because I enjoy painting and art, but at the same time, like would I go to a history museum today? Honestly, not, because history to me, when I think of that and I think about learning about that, I think about the TV, like History Channel, and I think about going on YouTube to look up like World War II videos, right? Like I mean, that's what I think about when I think about history. So it all comes back to that role, like what role does it really play?
Great, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the buying power of Gen Z? And the question came in earlier, there's the younger side of Gen Z, the older side, and then the fact is that many Gen Zers have millennial parents. So how does that all interplay with the information that you are able to provide to the organizations you work with in your own thinking about Gen Z?
So, sorry, the question is more on the like intersectional identities that exist within, between Gen Alpha, Gen
understanding
Z
that, and exactly. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think, and I guess this is a great way to put a big lens into this, but Gen Z is a meaningless term. Coming from a person that runs a Gen Z consultancy as a Gen Z or someone who identifies with that a lot, but like at the end of the day, it's a very meaningless term that is just used as a way, mostly for marketers, mostly for people to be able to understand in some ways a group of people. But the differences between a person born in 96 and 97 are minuscule, but what's really important is and the reason these terms are used is to be able to identify and group some of these commonalities together that really help to understand and give a lens into the behaviors. And we study Gen Z a lot, but I think like this age range a lot, but I think more importantly is understanding how that's changed and evolved from older ages to younger ages. And that's why like having so many, sorry, am I frozen? Oh no, okay.
You're good.
Okay. That's why like having that intergenerational workforce I think is really important, is because that allows you to have those multiple perspectives that exist together. Like there is no to say, even if we're looking at Gen Z specifically, to say a trait about Gen Z is to grossly misunderstand what it means to be Gen Zer, because Gen Z is composed of so many different identities and intersectional beings that like it's impossible to narrate that into one group. But at the same time, like we have to be able to group people together to understand what similarities exist. So I think it's equally important to study millennials. It's equally important to study Gen Z and Gen Alpha, and also the commonalities between them to understand what differences there are and how those differences came about.
That was great, and a really great guide to understanding why it's important to talk about generations and studying them. We have a question from Aaron B. How do you think museums will have a role in helping people seek authentic sources for information, given how AI will generate information that will challenge what they know is real, not real? Is this possibly a marketing angle for us? Great question, Aaron. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big challenge today is that the idea of truth is very muddled. Like what is true and what is not has been pretty much lost. Now that everything is decentralized and there's no more singular source of truth, where we go to find that information becomes a question of in question. And so I do think actually that we've seen this evolution of trust go from institution to organization to influencer to creator to community. But at some point, when there's so many varied sources of truth coming from so many different places, there has to be some source at the core of it that actually stands for the truth. And I think the Smithsonian or museum itself, like, if we were to do this research, is probably known as a trusted source, even if it feels older and feels more institutional, it's probably still known for that. And so I do think to your question, I do think there's a marketing angle in there, but I think there's a real identity piece in there of like being that source of truth for a generation that feels that truth has been disrupted by so many different sources.
It's great. And my colleague put in the chat, you can come touch a moon rock. And so we have that over at YouTube, which is a pretty cool comment. Thank you for sharing that. We have a question from Carolina. What's your question for our guest?
Hi, I'm Carolina at Smithsonian Science Education Center. And to build a little bit off Daria's question, I know education programs are probably a pretty unsexy topic to Gen Z, but we have these programs that are geared toward teens. Like, for example, we just had an application for high school students to create climate change focused videos that would be shown at the Nobel Prize Summit. I know climate change is very much at the forefront of young people today. But historically, our outreach has been to students through educators and maybe some parents as well. How can we reach out directly to these students on social media? Because pitching something that is essentially bonus homework on social media is a bit of a hard sell.
Yeah, good question. I mean, to the point made earlier about information overload, I think is additionally relevant here because no one really wants to be sold to, especially this generation. And not that you're selling stuff, but I think the idea of using social media to approach people, young people, is not necessarily the most an approach that will resonate the most with a young audience. I think when we think about how to use content, how to use social media, it's how to attract them in. The algorithm will work in many wondrous ways, and part of that is finding people who are interested in niche topics and being able to deliver that content to them. And so I guess I would, if we're talking specifically about the use of social media content, I would say it's less about pushing that content to people, and more about pulling them in and figuring out how we can be magnetic, how we can attract the right audiences to us by finding and speaking to the people that want to listen to us.
Great. And maybe a final question. Are there educational institutions, educational organizations that you think are doing a really good job, even potentially museums, that you think are doing a really good job to engage Gen Z audiences and are potential models for us to follow, or that you would recommend?
I don't know if this is a telling answer to that question, but I don't know if I could name too many. I mean, like, I think does Khan Academy count? Like, I think the things that are top of mind for me and for many young people are the online platforms that we've used to grow up with and to help us. Quizlet, Khan Academy, like these platforms that have helped us to develop our knowledge to get to where we are today, I would say are the ones that are succeeding. I can take a deeper dive into some of that and get back to you, but nothing comes to the top of my mind.
I think it's absolutely fine. I want to thank you again for speaking. I think if you clearly see from the topic that we were really interested in. Thank you again, and I really appreciate everyone for showing up on such a beautiful day in the DC area and for posing all these wonderful questions and for making the chat so rich. This recording will be added to the Prism page, so do check out the Prism page for this talk and all the other ones. And then unfortunately, we won't be meeting until next month, but we have some great upcoming talks. So please join the series, and I hope to see you later. And again, thank you so much for this information. And we'll be sharing out reports from dcdx, so be on the lookout for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the time.